Well, hello, and welcome to episode 25 of the Bomb City Podcast. My name is Nick, and my guest this episode is Professor Denise Sandoval. Professor Sandoval is an instructor at CSU Northridge. She's an expert in Chicano studies, and lowriding. She's curated a few events you guys may have seen, like the most recent one at the Petersen Museum, The High Art of Riding Low. She's doing another one right now at a gallery called CAM in Raleigh, North Carolina. It's called Viva Viclas, so it covers lowriding and motorcycles. Really interesting stuff. I think it's fascinating that there are still some open questions in car culture and automotive history, particularly when it comes to lowriding. Now, in my humble opinion, I think that's because the origins of lowriding were never really documented in any meaningful way. So, looking back from 2020 and trying to figure out how everything got started, it's very complicated. These are very complicated topics to begin with. So I was absolutely thrilled to get to talk with an expert on this. I hope you guys enjoyed the interview. There's a lot of information in here. I think it is very cool. So thank you guys so much for listening. And thank you so much to Professor Sandoval for giving us your time. I had a really great time recording this. We're going to jump into this immediately talking about one of my favorite subjects, the origins of lowriding. Okay, so here it is. Hope you guys enjoy it. This is episode 25, Professor Denise Sandoval. I was reading through the lowriding tradition book, and I saw in a couple places, there's, as far as like the things that me and my friends argue about, no one that I know can show a clear path from cars in the Pachuco days to lowriding in the 60s. Some people say, it comes from custom cars in general, and then lowriding takes on its own form in the 60s. Some people say this started, in the back streets of LA in the 40s, and then eventually was recognized as a mainstream thing in the late 50s or 60s. So I was more of talking culturally about lowriding.
Just to give, we could talk about this, but just like for instance, like the oldest lowrider car club in Los Angeles is the Dukes, and I think they might still be the oldest in continued existence. And so like this group started, which now we consider South LA, south of downtown. And they grew up in the area of the Pachucos of the famous Sleepy Lagoon case of 1942. So if you talk to Fernando, sadly Fernando passed away in 2010, but like the LA guys would call their cars Pachuco cars. They didn't call them lowriders. The lowrider, like what you get from that book, it was a label that was given by the police. So that's, and the connection between the Pachucos and the lowrider, that was obviously visualized in Lowrider magazine. It's always been there in LA because Pachuco culture was big here. Pachuco culture was big in the Bay Area, in Oakland, up in there too as well, and in San Diego on the West Coast. So, but in the side net, like these guys in the 40s were sort of like customizing cars. Really car customization, like at a full scale. Even though hot rodding, obviously hot rods happened before lowriders. So like some of even the stuff I read that there's no way to prove this of historical, like the people in Texas say, lowriding started in the 30s in El Paso. But how are you going to prove that? I don't know how you're going to prove that, And El Paso, Texas has even claimed Pachuco identity. So I don't know, it's just crazy. But I think for me, it's like it makes more sense to look at post-World War II, just to see the boom in sort of like car culture, car customization. But obviously that was started a lot earlier with like hot rods, right?
Right. I think for me, the thing that makes it confusing is like the Chicano identity. I don't think was something that was talked about up until at least the mid-60s. Is that about right?
Well, that's what I just said, is that's why the lowriders call their car Pachuco cars. But Chicano, the term Chicano, to correct you, actually was used in the 1920s to mean a lower class Mexican. And it actually was started as like a derogatory term in the 20s. So to be honest, there's people that Chicano identity goes back even further. But what you're speaking about is where it became politicized for civil rights movement. So those are like kind of like two different things, kind of like where the Black Power movement took a term black that had sort of a derogatory label and reaffirmed it and redefined it on their own terms. So Chicano is actually a term that has early roots in Texas and LA in the early 20th century.
I didn't know that. That's really interesting.
Yep.
So yeah, another thing that I struggle with is the language of this this part of the world in general. It's so confusing to me.
Like, what do you mean?
Like, I think there are people who would assume that if someone was working on a car and they were coming from a predominantly Mexican neighborhood in the 40s, that just that cultural grounding of where the car was being built would lend it more towards being a lowrider than being a custom. I don't know that I agree with that, but that's an argument that I've heard. So
look, if you know your LA history of car customization, is Chicanos, Mexicans, blacks, they were hot rodders too. So like, we weren't just like lowriders, like they were into car custom. The guy that put the first hydraulic system, Ron Aguirre, out in San Bernardino, Chicano, he was like into those kind of extreme car customs back in the day. So I think it's like sort of reassessing of like what you think the popular perception is now. But if you go back to the history, like Chicanos were hot rodding in the dry lake beds out in like the San Bernardino area in like the 30s and 40s and 50s, you know? So, and there were hot rodders that were black and Chicanos in LA. So I would imagine that also existed in other parts of urban areas that were black and Mexican American.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And maybe the thing that I'm missing is just the political definition of what it means to be Chicano.
Yeah, so at that case, you need to take a course, because I can't really define it literally, and it's not an easy question. I would totally suggest take a class on Chicano history at the local, up there in the Bay Area. You have tons of community colleges that you could take courses in to learn. So you have to do reading, you know?
Sure.
So what I can do now, and I teach history, so things are not easy answers for me.
Yeah, for sure. So
yeah.
So
I think history is complicated, as it should be, and I think like it's important to sort of like unpack, like even like the questions that you asked me that are based on not historical evidence, you know what I mean, like of reality. So, but you wouldn't know that because there's no books on Chicano hot rodders, you know.
Right.
Nobody's writing about it, but you get a good taste of it, of like how it exists in the present with the whole sort of Latino rockabilly, you know, rat rod scene. That's like a mix of low riding and hot rod, you know?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you have that up there.
Oh, yeah. There's a big, big scene here.
Yeah. So they're not low riders. You know, I would say they're more like hot rod, but they do even use Pachuco culture, you know, and Cholo culture and some of the aspects of low riding, but the style is completely different and nowhere those low riders.
So where did you start connecting with low riding and with the Chicano culture in general?
Well, I'm Chicano, and my family comes from East Los Angeles, right? So actually, like I live right off of Whittier Boulevard now, which was the head of, you know, low riding and cruising in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and even in parts of the 80s and even to today. So it's in my family roots. I mean, low riding was something that was always in my environment. I grew up in La Puente, which is about 20 minutes from East LA. Low riders were there too as well. So it was always something that was part of my neighborhood. But my family did not own cars and they weren't into low riding.
When did you decide to pursue this academically?
Well, I think it all started when I actually graduated from UC Berkeley, did my undergrad there, and that's where I saw my first old issues of Lowrider magazine. This was like 94, 95. No, excuse me, earlier than that. This was like 92, 93, and that's where I found in the library there at UC Berkeley some old issues of Lowrider magazine, and so I was very much interested in how the early magazines. Have you seen the early magazines?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, they're like kind of like these history, like community history books, right? Of like daily life, and it's so much more about like people, and there's like short stories, and you know, all the letters to the editor I found fascinating. And so that kind of piqued my interest, but it was literally probably in 96, 97, when I was working on my PhD in cultural studies at Claremont, and I was taking a class on popular culture, and then they asked me, you know, you're going to have to write a paper on a cultural space. So I went to Tower Records back in the day when you could go to Tower Records to get inspiration. And I walked by the magazine rack and I saw Japanese Lowrider magazine for the first time. So as I opened up Japanese Lowrider magazine, I was like, what the heck is this? It's like total Chicano culture in Japan, you know? Mm-hmm. So I kind of had the idea to write a paper for that class. And then, you know, I'm so old that, you know, you actually had to go to the library to do research back then. And I found no books. You know, I found a couple academic articles. So I sort of realized like, oh, this was an area that needed to be researched. But I didn't decide then that it would be the topic of my dissertation. Just because, like I said, even though it's my culture, it's where I come from, like I don't have any contacts, you know? Mm-hmm. And then literally I wrote that paper in like spring of 98, fall 97, 98. And then 6 months after that, the Petersen Automotive Museum was looking to have the first exhibit on lowrider culture and lowrider cars at the Petersen. And this was in 98. And I applied and I got the gig. So that was, being a curator on that exhibit allowed me sort of an entree into the lowrider scene. And that's sort of how I got started officially. And then, yeah, I've just been full in it for over 20 years.
Awesome. For that exhibit, is that the Arte y Estilo, the lowriding tradition?
Yeah, the Arte y Estilo. It opened up in 2000, yes.
Awesome. I got the book. I got it sitting in front of me.
I know, it's a cool book, huh?
It really is.
I mean, and it's crazy because that's the only catalog the Petersen has put out. Like the last two exhibits, I don't know. It's a whole other discussion. But if it was a hot rod show, we would have got a catalog. I know that much.
Right. I got the pamphlet for the high art of riding low next to me. It's also very cool, but it's.
I love it. I know. I got really lucky because. Yeah, like they allowed me to I really wanted something that was more in depth in, you know, the gallery guide. Yeah. For that, because with that show, it was more of an art show, right? So we were highlighting how artists, particularly Chicano artists, how they sort of engage in defining and redefining lowrider culture through the car, right? The car as object and subject. So, you know, meaning that there are going to be people coming into that space that do not have a history in Chicano art or language and knowledge. And so it was important to sort of provide that for our viewers. But the one thing that I really respect about the Petersen with this last show is that we had a over-the-top Chicano art exhibit there in a very white space. You know,
yeah,
and
definitely.
They didn't ask me to tone down the language or to change anything, to keep it authentic to the culture and also to the history of Chicano art in museums. And then, you know, I think it was really important that the Petersen, that they supported that and, you know, allowed that to happen.
That's awesome. In fact, that's one of the main reasons why I was so excited to give you a call. That exhibit was so cool. My wife and I made it down to go check it out. A friend of hers did a painting of her car for the show. And
which car was that? Was it Elrod's?
Yeah.
The purple car.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the Chevy.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, 57. That's my wife's car.
Yeah. Cool. That's so awesome. I didn't know that. That's pretty awesome. I know Elrod's amazing.
She's great, yeah. I actually got a chance to interview her on this podcast, too.
I know. I think her work is so amazing. And then also how, yeah, she's just also choosing sort of women as subject too as well. And images of, you know, empowering images of women that I think is really important. And that was also important that we had 10, you know, women artists in that show, and that 10 pieces of art by women artists, I should say. And I think that was really important for me.
That's cool. One of the really impressive things about that show to me was just how inclusive the exhibits were. You know, I know I'd say an okay amount about lowriding as it comes to cars, but not so much as it does to culture. I'm coming to it from custom cars, and we've only, you know, my family had a business. We go vend at car shows, and we set up at it's like a street low show or something like that down here or up here. And it was nice and the cars are fine and stuff, but there's this the sort of like machismo, like tough guy hyper masculinity vibe, which is really off-putting for to go out and find yourself in the middle of that. And the Petersen thing didn't seem to have any of that. In fact, in I forget which one of the books it is now, but that someone wrote about that directly. I thought that was really cool, that it wasn't just that a lot of people were seeing the same thing.
Yeah, and it's funny because as a woman, I would say car culture in general is very macho. I read it completely different. So, yeah. So I think like in general, there's machismo in car culture or in hip hop or whatever. It's just sort of, it's a dominant American. It's not specific to lowriding. But there's a lot more women in the lowriding scene now, and things are changing, so I think it's like, I don't know if it's machismo or it's just like our culture's obsession with sort of like hyper-masculinity that exists at all levels, from like music, athlete culture, car culture is also a part of it too as well, so.
Oh, sorry.
Hello?
Yeah, sorry. Cool. So we were talking about the Petersen that was around 2000. This latest show was in 2018.
Yeah, so there's been 3 shows at the Petersen. We had Arte y Estilo in 2000, like January to like June of 2000, and then the High Art and Low was the latest one. That was from July of like 2017 to like September of 2018. But then the second one in between that was oh my God, La Vida Lowrider, Cruising the City of Angels, and that was in 2007.
Oh, I remember seeing stuff about that. Yeah, that one looked really cool too. And you're doing something now with motorcycles, is that correct?
Yeah, it's Viva Viclas. It's at the Contemporary Art Museum in Raleigh, North Carolina. It'll be closing in a couple weeks, but it's sort of the first sort of lowrider culture exhibit on the East Coast, and it's focused on lowrider motorcycles, and it's the first time I've sort of looked at lowrider motorcycles. So that's why it's interesting what you were talking about machismo, because I feel motorcycle culture in general has more machismo than lowrider cars. There's just something, it's sort of like lowrider car adjacent, Viclas, motorcycles, fascinating, but it was interesting to like, it's affiliated, but it's also its own distinct culture with like its own rules, its own codes of the road. And I think even more so than lowrider culture, car, they're definitely keeping up sort of like that Pendleton, old like cholo look more than lowriders, because lowrider car clubs, I mean, they wear their T-shirts, they don't really keep up that aesthetic. So I found like the aesthetics of the Vicla culture really fascinating.
Yeah, it's really interesting. One thing that I didn't know when it started, Harley Davidson started making a motorcycle called the Lowrider, or at least a kind of the FX series in 1977. Yeah. And
they still like put that out. Yeah. And that's also what's very different is like a lot of the Viclas are Harleys, and I feel like Harley they do support that culture, and riding a motorcycle, it's more like affordable to customize it. More women are doing it versus like a car, right? It's really hard to buy early Chevys. That's really expensive, and then to have the money to take it to shop if you don't know how to customize it, right? Sort of prevents people from sort of owning that. But I think the motorcycles are a lot more affordable because they're customizing, like, I think the oldest that we had in our exhibit might have been an '07 one. So, I mean, like, that's not old, right?
Right. Yeah, it's neat. It's neat for a company that's been around so long, like Harley, to recognize that there's a market for something that's a little bit custom.
And I think like support. Yeah, and then also like supporting it as well. Because you could definitely see that, like, just like with lowriding, aesthetically and culturally, there's like tensions with hot rods and lowriders. Like over there is like choppers versus lowrider, right? But just like with hot rod and lowriding, you could see how the cultures also inspire each other in sort of customization style and paint styles too as well.
And are you like affiliated with a club or a car or anything like that? I don't remember. I apologize.
No, I'm
Okay.
not. I'm affiliated with the Chicano Studies.
Makes sense. I went to San Francisco State up here, and they had such
Yeah.
pride about starting like the ethnic studies program there.
Yeah, it's such an amazing history on that campus. It really is. It's still like it's such a important campus still to this day for like supporting sort of ethnic studies and social justice actions. And yeah, it's a great campus.
It's good weather too. San Jose State too.
Yeah, San Jose State's great too. Yeah, and I mean like the founders of Lowrider magazine graduated from San Jose State, and Sonny Madrid was working at San Jose State when he got the idea to start Lowrider magazine. And so I think it's so important to think about how, Chicano studies, how the ethnic studies in the Bay Area also inspired sort of the founders of Lowrider magazine, because they were also putting on Carcius versus Sar Chavez on that campus. And, obviously later on they brought the magazine down to Southern California, but, it definitely started in the Bay Area and sort of the politics of that sort of 60s and 70s social justice, civil rights movements, right, that were part of that.
Oh, I'm sorry. I completely lost my train of thought there for a second. So we were talking about Lowrider, which started at San Jose State, and it looks like Lowrider magazine, along with a ton of other print magazines, is getting killed off.
Yeah,
it's so wild. Like I guess social media and just their online publications are taking over for all that.
Yeah.
But a magazine like as culturally important as Lowrider, it's just interesting to think about how much things have changed. I guess there's no no one has a monopoly on information anymore, so you don't necessarily have to have a magazine to get out your ideas or spread your culture. And I think
it also leaves it it also leaves it open, like if there's people that'll start sort of those grassroots sort of zines or magazines, which people are also doing all the time. But I feel like lowrider culture is not dependent on the magazine to survive. Like guys would be lowriding regardless if there was a magazine or not. But I think like what it adds is this sort of layer of, which they haven't answered that question. I mean, Lowrider magazine, has the super show every year, September in Vegas, right? That sort of crowns the lowrider car of the year. I mean, there's like a whole car show circuit that's tied to that I think that to me is what's even more important, what's going to happen to that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that remains to be seen.
Do you feel like the politics that Lowrider magazine came out of are a part of the, what's the right way to say this? How important do you think politics are to lowriding?
Like politics in which sense?
Well, my take on like the earlier bomb lowriders is that it's a political statement where people are looking back. So I wonder how much politics played into like the evolution of the lowrider in the 60s in the like the bomb aesthetic, because they're looking back quite a ways back to the late 40s, early 50s. To me, that seems like it's the late 60s. Politics are identity is becoming really important.
More, I don't even know if it's like, I mean, the thing is, I think what you're pointing to is like, you can look at nostalgia as political, and I would argue, yes, right? Because it's sort of this nostalgia, looking at sort of an earlier time, nostalgia one, and sort of like claiming our roots, because obviously our roots as Chicanos, Mexican Americans go back, over 100 years, or even for some of us whose family has been here before it became the United States. But I think like the lowrider car and the Pachuco, why those are sedimented is that these were these cultures that developed sort of this pride in being Mexican American, right? Who of youth that were not Mexican, their parents are Mexican, and yet they're American, but they were not being accepted in America because of all the racism that existed in the early 20th century. And so it's the same way of sort of thinking about why is in African American culture, there's also, even in hip hop, you have this nostalgia returning to the past, right? Looking at the past. And so I don't know if it's unique, but I think it makes sense, particularly for cultures and histories that experienced racism, that, Mexicans became part of this country as war, African Americans are brought to this country because of slavery. I think looking in history and even modern cultural spaces of music, art, car culture, poetry, whatever, how we reference the past, carries in those elements that what you say could be read as political, but I think in the end, it's like, how in the present are we continuing to connect to the past? And why are we connecting to the past? What's important about that? Because there's a resource in that of claiming sort of our right to exist here, because that is the world that we're living in, where we're constantly still having to fight, whether I be as a woman, fight for my own rights, or as African American or Chicano or a poor person or LGBTQ person. Like, everything that we do, our everyday life is political, right? Mm-hmm. So it would make sense that cultural spaces and what we participate in are also going to carry in those realities and how they look and how they're visualized. To me, it's important that how we unpack, what is political, right? It's very complicated. Yeah. But I think to unpack it, it connects back, right, to like why, to me, these cultural spaces are not just in the now, they're connected to the past. And there's a reason why people are engaging with history or historical moments, right? Because it also reveals a history of cultural resistance, which all communities have, right? Is like, if you're poor, if you don't have rights to the media, like, what are you going to use, right? Back in the day, people started with what they had, their bodies, their cars, to tell their stories, to create community, and that still exists. You think about hip hop and how it started in the Bronx in '74. It's like people started with their bodies, breakdancing. They didn't have museums. Oh, we're going to use graffiti, and we don't have instruments, so we're going to manipulate records, and our voice become, the tool that we use, right, to claim space and to talk about our history and our realities. So I think that's why American culture, it connects to other people around the world, right? Especially like hip hop and lowriding, because it allows people in other countries to use that form, but to tell their stories using an American form, right? Lowriding is an American tradition. Hip hop is American, right? And so I think it's interesting how like those are two cultures that just globally have made an impact. I mean, hip hop a lot more than lowriding, but there's a reason why, right? Because I think it's accessibility of it, particularly with hip hop, for people to like create space, right, and to like name their experience. And that's why I think it's fascinating that lowriding, as it moves around the world, to different parts of the world, like, and some of them have American cars and some don't, right, over there. But they're still sort of drawn to that aesthetics because they read it as different than their own, outsider. And I think there's something about being an outsider of resistance that's important.
Oh, yeah. God, I was watching a video of like a Soviet Lada dragging through a parking lot the other day. I remember I took this really awesome class when I was in school on Latino music. And this idea, and I apologize, the word is not coming, but it's the word for how like people would map over like their Orisha to their Catholic saint, like the way they would find the way to make the old religion work under the control of the new one. What in the world is that? Oh,
like syncretism?
Yes.
Yeah, syncretism,
and that's a huge part of Latino culture, because in Latin music, you've got the Tres Raíces, right? There's Spain, Africa, and the indigenous people of the Americas. And there seems to me to be just something about this blend of cultures that works. It's so flexible, like, that people can see that, like, people love Mexican food around the world because it's delicious. And
but yet people in the U.S., they love their Mexican food, but they still want to build that fucking wall, right? So it's that contradiction. So I wouldn't use that. It's not powerful. I mean, it's something that people get enjoyment in, but they don't want those people living next to them or seeing them, right? So that's good old American racism at its core. But I think like syncretism or cultural blending, it is American culture. American culture is, I would argue, it's all mixture, right? For all of this movement of like, we're losing values, white American values and all this. Like, it's like a myth, right? It's like, as you go back and you're like, Black culture, is like the face of American culture around the world, right? Back in the day, we had, we didn't have hip hop, jazz, right? An American form, a Black American cultural form was a global force, right? And the USO used jazz musicians to build their global relations around the world, right? So, I think it's true what you said. I mean, I think I would argue that Latino culture is not unlike a lot of cultures around the world. That's a result of blending, But that doesn't erase I can only speak of specifically Mexican culture, but that doesn't mean that there isn't racism in Mexico, right? Or there isn't racism in Latin America, right? Because through our colonization process, that's how we were sort of learned sort of white supremacy and white privilege, right? So if you look at who's the most oppressed in Mexico, it's the indigenous, right? Just like in our own country here.
Right.
Yeah, but that's a great question.
I think it's so interesting. I'm third generation Italian American, and my family ditched our culture immediately. The first generation born here didn't speak Italian. We anglicized our last name to Celeste from Celeste, and and then my family moved just progressively across the country till I was born here in California, sort of on my own with no culture of my own, and the idea that these cultures are so strong and they're passed on, and it I don't know, I geek out on Latino culture so much because it's the world that I was born into in California, and it was
and I think that's the thing too, is like when you grow up here in California, it's like, you have to try really hard not to interact with Latino culture, right?
Right.
But yet people do, and people are off-putting. But sometimes I think there's like more recent arrivals that don't get it. But it's like, if you look, just like in the Bay Area, LA's the same, where it's like, Blacks and Chicanos and Asians and whites, we lived side by side and interacted for years and years. There's a long history of music and dance sort of interactions. So like, I don't completely buy into this sort of myth that like there's all this inter-ethnic tensions, but I think exactly what you said is like, that's what makes California so great, is that diversity allows you to interact with different cultures and take some of those cultures into your own identity, right?
Right. Yeah, I can't speak to the experience outside of California, or really outside the Bay Area, but the community I'm a part of now is very inclusive, and it's so big, and like it's I don't know what it is. It seems like the Latino part of the culture is sort of what brings a lot of people in California together. I don't know. Maybe I'm
and I think, and it's interesting because like both Oakland and LA, right, are sort of dealing with gentrification, and the impacts of that, remains to be seen of how it's going to change, right, the cultural milieu of our communities, because like I also think of Oakland as a very Black town. You know what I'm saying? Like more so than LA. And so even that, right, is sort of under attack with sort of like gentrification, and you think about Oakland, you have that history of like the Black Panthers, right, and a long history of African American political activism as well.
Yeah, we have a street or two over from me is where the East Bay Dragons clubhouse is, and they're a huge deal. A Black motorcycle club.
Yeah, awesome. That's cool. I know. I feel like the whole like African Americans just have a really long history in motorcycle clubs. It might have been about like 10 years ago down here at the California African American Museum, they had an exhibit called Black Chrome. They had a catalog. If you get it, like you should get it. It's about a little bit bigger than the size of the Arte y Estilo one, but it was so good. And that's when I learned that like, there were like Black motorcycle clubs like in the 30s, like the first African American women were like part of it too as well. And there was like a woman, the first one to like ride cross country. I think it happened like in the 30s or 40s. It was just, I learned so much. It's just so fascinating, right? Because then you have to put that history in the context of the Jim Crow South, right? And the civil rights movement, and how I think motorcycles, there's just a freedom of motorcycles in the road that you just do not have in a car, you know, and I think that was something of doing the Vicla show. You reminded me of like, it's just different. You know, you're so much more connected to nature, environment. It's much more dangerous. You become part of the bike. It's just kind of like the Old West, you know, it's kind of like riding a horse, the iron horse. That's why they call it the iron horse, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Because
with cars, you're so protected and you interact with nature and everything differently too, you know? But it's just fascinating, like the different, the different cultures, motorcycle, car. But I think that's a fascinating history of the long history of African-American motorcycle clubs, you know?
Yeah, definitely. So you mentioned gentrification. I think that's something that's been on a lot of people's mind. Like, things are changing so fast in Oakland. It's hard to recognize downtown these days.
Right.
Seems like a month or two will go by and there's another apartment complex popping up. What does that look like out by you? Like,
the same way. Because the same money that was up in the Bay Area is now in LA. So, like, LA is changing fast. It's fast and furious, man. I hate to use that, but it really is. So, it's intense right now. So, like even my apartment building was sold and I had to move, and it's all around the downtown area, and they're building just like over there. Like, they just build those sort of like apartment complexes that are like 4 or 5 stories high. And then they'll put like, you know, the retail space below, right? It's like a total like format.
Yeah, totally.
And I don't know where all these people are coming from, but like just my neighborhood in Highland Park that I left, like it started changing within the last 10 years, but I would say super accelerated within the last 6. And it's mostly white people, not from California.
Yeah.
And so then they sort of have, like, I would prefer white people from California, because then it goes back to what you were saying, you know, Latinos existed, you know, that is diverse. It's like they come to your neighborhood and they just have this sort of elite attitude. You know, it's really crazy. And it's even weirder because I don't know how it looks like over there, but the hipsters are, you know, they're wearing look like secondhand clothes, you know. They look like they're poor, but I'm like, why, you know, but they're not, right? Because they don't even, it's the day, and like they're in coffee shops, restaurants, nobody's working, you know, everybody's socializing. I keep thinking, like, what do they do for a job, you know?
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah, it's complicated. Oakland's one of those towns where I've learned that you just speak to everyone the same way, because you don't know if someone's like a hipster millionaire here or they just got off the street. Like, you can't judge people based on what they look like here. But the housing thing to me is really confusing. I mean,
it's scary because it's what we were talking about. It really is like affordable housing, right?
Yeah.
Accessible housing, you know, it's like where people shouldn't be working, where 70-80% of their check is going to where they're going to live, you know. That's a disturbing part of gentrification. So then what does it do? Where does it push people out? Where do these people go? I don't know. In LA, we've had an increase in homelessness, like skyrocketing, and people living out of trailers, living in parks, living around the LA River, which is like not really a river, it's like a concrete river, you know. So, I mean, that's the effects, right? And people like not, and I mean, that's why I thought it was impressive that the governor put that, extended the rent control, right?
Yeah.
The buildings in 1989, you know, because it was going crazy in California, you know?
Yeah, I was really surprised. I don't want to go too political, but this is local politics, so it's all right. Because Newsom, when he was mayor of San Francisco, he moved to the Haight. And he immediately passed the sit-lie law, and the city said no. He went around them and took it to a vote and got it passed. And so, like, since then, I've had this, like, Newsom, really? Like, and I'd held that against him for a really long time.
Yeah.
But I'll be damned if he's not doing the right thing with housing so far. I mean... Yeah,
so far. I mean, it's not like he's perfect, like with every politician, right? It's like he's good on this, bad on that. But, yeah, I mean, I was surprised that happened, you know? And so, like, I could have stayed in my apartment, but I was like, I'm moving because I'm like, these assholes that own the apartment, like, they're your landlords. Like, I don't trust them, right? But there were so many, at least I had the luxury to move, but there were so many Latino families in my building that like couldn't, you know? So I'm happy for them, like that. I hope that this law will help them, but we'll see. But I think in general, you know, I mean, to sort of get back to sort of like car culture, I think like it sort of impacts, you know, I think to have cars and to customize cars takes money, right? So I think the connection to gentrification is like if people are spending their money on housing, right, or just cost of living, like how do you have money to like customize, right, or be part of like car culture? So, I mean, that remains to be seen, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, hell, a big part of the reason we ended up buying in the neighborhood we did here is so we could have a garage. Like there was
cool.
There's nothing downtown where you could park a car. So yeah, we're out here in the flats where we've got detached garages, and it's fantastic. But
that's great.
That's our weird hobby, shaping housing.
Yeah, that's awesome. So then you are a hot rodder, right?
I'd say a custom car guy. I never built anything fast.
Okay, cool. No, I just watched this weekend that movie, The Ford versus Ferrari.
Oh, yeah?
Did you see that movie? Did you see it?
I didn't see it. No, I've been meaning to check it out, but...
It's really good. I was surprised how much I enjoyed it. But it was, like Matt Damon and Christian Bale, I mean, they're amazing actors. But, there was just I didn't even know that. Like, you know, I didn't know that Ford, like, got into the racing business because Henry Ford's son was, like, insulted by Mr. Ferrari, pretty much.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of car company rivalry drives a lot of product.
Yeah, but it was it was a good movie, but it made you think about like, just like about corporate control, because that movie dealt with how Ford was trying to like corporatize sort of their winning, you know, and like spin it, and then that sort of takes away from sort of like the competitive side of like the racing, you know, and all of that. But yeah, I learned a lot. Like I didn't know about that Shelby guy who had designed all those cars, and they had a car named after him. I was like, so I learned a lot in watching that movie. But overall, it was just an enjoyable movie, you know.
Cool. I'll try and check that out. So, what sort of stuff are people working on at your school in your department these days? Like, are cars still popular with kids?
I would say that, like, I don't know how it is. Like, I would say, to get back to the slogan I used, I would say that, like, the Fast and Furious world of the movies has impacted, you've seen car culture, right? Where I think, like, this younger generation, and you even see it on the road, like, everybody thinks they're, like, Vin Diesel, right, or something, you know, Fast and the Furious. So I feel like that's more about fast cars, right, or, like, drifting, right? Every so often I get a kid that's into car culture, but typically they're like using cars that they drive, so they're more like recent cars. But like old cars, I don't see it so much. I mean, it either takes money for old cars, or you have to have connections, right, to sort of get into that. So I would say in general, like most of my students are like first generation college students. So if they're in car culture, they're like, you know, using the cars that they drive. Like I've had students that were into those, where, you know, I don't even know what it's called, but they take like the 80s Hondas and they soup them up. They do drifting with them, but I forget what it's called.
Oh, I'd call it a drift car. I don't know too much about it, though.
No, but they like 80s Hondas, like 80s, early 90s, because they're like easier to like make the modifications on. I think it's sense. Before like the Honda started putting like computers and stuff on their cars, right? But yeah, I've seen that. But in general, I would say like I see more skateboarders than I see like students in car culture. Yeah. Skateboarding's big down here.
Yeah, it was big at my school too, but it was just a spread out campus.
Yeah.
It's cool. One really neat thing about going to a state school, I know they're like, not everyone appreciates them as much as they should, but I went to almost exclusively I went to school with almost exclusively first generation immigrants. So
Yeah.
the amount of culture that you get exposed to. Like my partner on my senior project immigrated from Cambodia. Like his family fled Pol Pot.
Yeah.
And the state schools are awesome. If anyone's looking for culture, that's a great place to find it.
Yeah, I mean they're very diverse. Exactly, they're very diverse, and I feel like the state schools right now, we are the campuses for working class students, and that's why it's disturbing to me to see what's happening at the CSU of the move towards privatization and getting money from the outside, and they're wanting to raise admission standards to, like, on some campuses to 3.0. So you're thinking, like, okay, who are the students that we're going to pull from? You know, and even if a student doesn't have a 3.0, doesn't mean they can't make it here, right? So it's becoming like they're trying to follow the model of what the UC did and the UC system did in the late 90s and early 21st century that changed the demographics. And so it's disturbing, and we're fighting it, you know, because they're making, like, for instance, Cal State LA, they're limiting where we can even draw students from. So, like, there's certain neighborhoods in LA that we can't accept students from, or it's just crazy. So everything that you said, that, like, what we valued, like, that's what I feel is under attack, you know, in the next 10 years. And it's already started, is what I'm saying.
Yeah,
so it's like that question is our campuses, are they going to remain to be diverse? For me, it's like, it's just also a class thing, right? It's like working class students can afford to come to the CSU and still even work, right? A lot of my students, they work full-time, part-time, and go to school.
Yeah, I did 3 jobs at mine.
And that's going to change, right? If they put in these sort of different admission requirements, or even just on a basic level, just raise tuition, right? It also cuts off the chances for students to attend, you know, because, like, California, their whole move is like, oh, they should go to the community colleges, but California doesn't fund their community colleges. They're not building more community colleges, so there's going to be people that are pushed out of community colleges because there isn't space, right?
Yeah.
It's going to take you 10, 15 years to get out of the community college.
Yeah. Yeah, God, I was in community college for 8 years before I transferred.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
No, I transferred in like 1.5 to Berkeley. I was like, I'm not staying there. I'm like, I needed to bounce quick.
Yeah, I understand. No, I was an engineering major, and they didn't offer classes every semester, so you had to, like, bounce around from school to school, and it was
exactly. A nightmare. Yeah, it is. It's like a institutional barrier, right? To getting through in a timely manner, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. One thing I was thinking about while we're talking about you know, the ethnic studies protest, like the BSU did at SF State, and then the Chicano movement around the time Lowrider magazine started at San Jose State. And one thing that I keep seeing, which seems sort of novel now, is that eventually people listened at one point, and I don't see that now. I don't see student protests paying off in any meaningful way, and it's incredibly disappointing.
Yeah, I mean, I think people, like, their definition of, like, protest is different. Like, there is something about having physical bodies in a space or action versus, like, just putting your comment on Twitter, right? Or creating memes on Instagram. So I think, like, that is definitely something that, like, I always tell my students that, you know, they always tell you that knowledge is power, but I argue that the real power is what you do with that knowledge, and that we have to be, like, you know, active agents for social change and social justice, and it's action, you know, it's not. And if a previous generation put their bodies on the line to create access for us here at the CSU, like, we have to continue that tradition, you know, because the students 50 years ago were thinking about this generation's students, right?
Yeah.
And so I think I think it's just shifting the mindset, because this millennial generation, or whatever they're calling now, Generation Z, I don't know, it's always changing, right? I think that seeing themselves as part of this larger collective action, like shifting it, you know, and it's happening, you know. For all the like attacks, I think on millennials, I'm very hopeful because I feel that they're very creative. I see my students; they're very creative and very artsy and critical thinkers. So I'm hopeful.
I'm technically a millennial. I call myself in the rerun generation because I was born in '85, so I'm not quite a millennial. We saw out analog and saw in digital.
No, yeah, you're not. Yeah, I think you're at the cusp of like Gen X too, which is my gen.
Right. But yeah, I grew up watching like your generation's movies and TV shows on rewind or on reruns.
Yeah.
But one thing I know about my generation is we were incredibly skeptical. We grew up through a lot, and I don't know that people are looking to build a better country 20 years down the road that come from my generation. A lot of us just see things as pretty doomed. I don't think as a whole we're as inactive as the stereotype of Gen X, but we're pretty bad. Like we could be doing a lot better.
Yeah, and it's crazy because like I don't see that so much in my students because when my students are first gen, a lot of them were either born here or they were brought here when they're babies, but most of them were born here and their parents are the ones that immigrated here at 12 and 13 or undocumented. And so for my students, they know that they have to work hard. They know that they're not just there for themselves, but they're there for their families. When you have parents that are working 2-3 jobs, as gardeners, as maids, as the most under economy jobs that they can get, like these are my students. This is their family, right? So for them, it's like, they're not skeptical. They're filled with hope and like hard work. So I feel lucky.
That's a refreshingly optimistic way to look at that.
Yeah. Well, I have to, man. I mean, I wouldn't be doing this if I don't. There's so many things happen in our world where you don't give you hope that you have to, you have to have that spirit and you have to be doing work that contributes to that, of creating change, in around issues of social justice.
Sure. Anticipating doom and gloom is a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Exactly. Like, I mean, I always still love that quote, that great quote by Gandhi of like, you have to be the change that you want in the world. And so I think that's, when you sort of are given to gloom and doom, you're disempowering yourself. You are tying the lock on the chains, right? And you're accepting it versus like you refuse to see that, right? If you're not seeing possibilities, you're not creating change. And that is how the other side wins, by your own sort of nihilism feeds, right, sort of the world that we're living in. They count on people that give up.
I always try to find a good way to wrap these up, although that last part I think was pretty awesome.
Well, I think on the other side, I think a good way to wrap it up is thinking about why culture matters, why pop culture matters, why does car culture matter, or music culture, or fashion culture. I think it's like it allows us to sort of get back what I said towards the beginning. It allows a space to sort of redefine and negotiate their everyday lives, to create identities and create community in a world that oftentimes they feel displaced or marginalized. So I think that pop culture has a lot of power because it starts with the people, right? So like what we were even talking about before, like, well, there's no Lowrider magazine. Well, we'll still lowride without that, right? If corporate America decided, we're not going to use hip-hop culture to sell products, you think hip-hop culture would go away? No, because it was always about the people, right? I think that when it crosses over and there's more corporate influence on our culture and impacting it, that's the problem. I think the more that it stays sort of with the people to define it, to have the power to create sort of the worlds they want, and I think worlds is a more accurate description of what we have in the United States, but that it is one that is about sort of recognizing the diversity, right, that exists in the United States. And I think that lowriding has a long tradition of sort of creating sort of the individual identity, but community identity as well. And even though it's sort of affiliated with Mexican American culture, African Americans, white guys also are lowriders. And so it is a very diverse culture because it's the love of cars that brings people together. And I think that there's power in that as well, right? Is that people through their love of cars, they're able to learn about each other, learn about their different cultures, take on some of new cultures into their identity. And so I see it, that is then radical politics, right, of popular culture.
Awesome. Well, that's perfect. That's why you're the professor of this. Thank you so much. This was a lot of fun.
No, thank you. Yes. Good luck. Let me know how it goes cutting and pasting everything together.
Okay, for sure. So,
all right. Well, it was great talking with you. And keep in touch, okay?
All right, that's it. That is episode 25. Thank you guys for listening, and thank you so much to Professor Sandoval for your time. What a special episode. I was so excited to get this one out there. Like I mentioned in the podcast, I'm a real big history geek, and the fact that there's this open question in custom cars is just mind-blowing to me. To think that in 2020, in this time where we have instant access to information, I could go on, a car builder's Instagram and figure out what they're building today, that we have this chunk of automotive history, like really from, the 1930s till the 1960s or 70s even, that was never really documented in the first place. Like the early lowriders, the early, the Pachuco cars of the 40s. It's so fascinating to me. And it was a really unique opportunity to speak with someone on this episode that really knows what they're talking about. I have so much respect for academia. The college professors have to work so hard to prove a point. They have to do actual and new research. They have to defend topics to other experts. So Professor Sandoval's opinions really carry a lot of weight with me, and I have so much respect for her profession. So what a cool opportunity. What a cool chance for all of us to get taken to class for an hour and hear an expert's opinion on some of these topics. So that's it. That's all I got. Thank you guys so much for listening, and we'll catch you next time.